In late 2024, during what was meant to be a quiet family gathering at his Malibu home, something unusual happened around Hollywood legend Dick Van Dyke. The cameras were not rolling. There were no reporters, no stage lights, just family. For decades, the world had known him as the man who danced across rooftops in Mary Poppins and brought laughter into American living rooms through the Dick Van Dyke Show. The energy, the smile, the almost impossible optimism that seemed untouched by time. But that evening, the mood inside the house was different. His children and grandchildren gathered around the living room, speaking in quieter tones than usual. At 100 years old, every moment with him had begun to carry a new weight. Not the weight of scandal or controversy that haunts many Hollywood legends, but something far more human. The quiet realization that time, eventually, reaches everyone. Friends close to the family have long described Van Dyke as someone who refused to surrender to age. Even into his late 90s, he was still exercising, singing, dancing, and appearing publicly with the same spark that made him famous in the 1960s. But behind the laughter and the public appearances, those closest to him had begun to notice subtle changes. Moments when he moved more slowly. Pauses in conversation that lasted just a little longer than they used to. Small reminders that even the brightest stars of Hollywood cannot outrun time forever. For his family, the question was no longer whether the world would eventually have to say goodbye. The question was when. And more importantly, how. Because for millions of fans around the world, Dick Van Dyke was never just another actor. He represented a kind of Hollywood that almost no longer exists. A time when charm felt genuine, when comedy felt joyful, when one man's energy could fill an entire screen. But the truth about legends is rarely shown on camera. Behind the laughter, the dancing, and the timeless performances was a life shaped by struggle, resilience, and moments of doubt that the public almost never saw. To understand why the possibility of losing Dick Van Dyke feels so personal to so many people, you have to go back much further than Hollywood. You have to go back to the beginning, to a small town in America during the Great Depression, to a boy who had no idea that one day the entire world would know his name. Long before the bright lights of Hollywood, before the laughter of studio audiences and the timeless choreography that would make him a household name, Dick Van Dyke was simply a boy growing up in the American Midwest during one of the most difficult economic periods in modern history. He was born on December 13th, 1925, in the small city of West Plains, Missouri, though he would grow up primarily in Danville, Illinois. America, at the time, was still feeling the deep scars of the Great Depression. Families across the country struggled with uncertainty, and stability was never guaranteed. His father, Loren Wayne Van Dyke, worked as a salesman. It was a profession that required constant travel and offered little security. His mother, Hazel Victoria, was a stenographer, balancing work and family life in a time when opportunities for women were limited. The household was not one of luxury or privilege. Like many families during that era, the Van Dykes lived modestly, and the future often felt uncertain. Yet even in those early years, there were signs that Dick Van Dyke was not quite like other children. Friends and neighbors would later remember a boy who seemed to carry an unusual energy with him wherever he went. He loved performing small comedy routines for classmates. He mimicked voices, exaggerated gestures, and often turned ordinary moments into something theatrical. Entertainment, even in its simplest form, fascinated him. But the path toward that world was not obvious. In fact, for much of his youth, Van Dyke believed his life would follow a far more traditional direction. He once imagined becoming a minister. The idea came from a strong religious environment in which he was raised. Church gatherings and community events played a large role in the rhythm of life in Danville. For a young man searching for purpose, ministry seemed like a natural path. Yet something else kept pulling his attention. Radio shows, movies, vaudeville-style comedy routines that were still echoing through American entertainment culture during the 1930s and early 1940s. Van Dyke became captivated by performers who could command attention through movement and timing. He studied comedians carefully, observing how physical gestures could create laughter even before a single word was spoken. This fascination slowly reshaped his ambitions. Then history intervened. When the United States entered World War II, millions of young Americans faced a sudden shift in their futures. Like many teenagers of his generation, Dick Van Dyke left high school early in 1944 to enlist in the United States Army Air Forces. His dream at the time was to become a pilot, but fate had something else in mind. After training revealed that he was underweight for pilot duties, the military reassigned him to the Special Services Division. Instead of flying aircraft, Van Dyke began entertaining troops through radio broadcasts and live performances designed to raise morale. It was an unexpected turning point. Standing in front of soldiers who desperately needed laughter during wartime, he discovered something profound about himself. Performance was not just something he enjoyed. It was something he was meant to do. The young man who once imagined preaching sermons was now learning how to command a stage, how to hold attention, how to make people forget their worries, even if only for a few minutes. Without realizing it, Dick Van Dyke was beginning the journey that would eventually transform him into one of the most recognizable entertainers in television history. But the climb to that level of fame would not happen quickly, and it would certainly not happen easily. When Dick Van Dyke returned home after World War II, the world he stepped into looked very different from the one he had left. America was entering a new era of optimism and growth, but for a young man with no formal acting training, breaking into entertainment was anything but simple. Van Dyke did not arrive in Hollywood with connections or a carefully mapped career plan. What he had instead was instinct. The same instinct that had helped him entertain soldiers during the war now pushed him towards stages, microphones, and any opportunity that allowed him to perform. His earliest work came through radio. Local stations in Illinois offered small openings for comedy sketches and variety segments, and Van Dyke quickly discovered that the medium suited him. Radio demanded strong timing, improvisation, and personality. Even without the benefit of physical movement, his natural humor and warmth began attracting attention. But radio alone was not enough. Television was beginning to emerge as the next great frontier in American entertainment, and Van Dyke sensed the shift early. In the late 1940s, he partnered with a radio personality named Phil Erickson, forming a comedy duo that began performing on regional television. The program was modest, broadcast locally, and far from glamorous. Yet it provided something invaluable: experience. Van Dyke learned how television cameras worked. He learned how audiences reacted differently when watching through a screen rather than sitting in a theater. Most importantly, he learned how to use his body as part of the performance. His tall, loose-limbed physicality became an asset rather than a limitation. Still, success remained uncertain. For years, he moved between small television appearances, stage productions, and occasional hosting jobs. Some shows lasted only weeks. Others disappeared before gaining any national recognition. In an industry famous for sudden breakthroughs, Van Dyke's progress was slow and unpredictable. Then, in the late 1950s, a crucial opportunity appeared: Broadway. In 1960, Van Dyke was cast in the musical Bye Bye Birdie, a lively stage production that captured the excitement of America's growing pop culture landscape. The role required more than comedic timing. It demanded singing, dancing, and a level of stage presence that few performers could sustain night after night. Van Dyke embraced it completely. His performance was energetic, charming, and physically expressive in a way that audiences found irresistible. Critics took notice. The show became a hit, and in 1961 he won a Tony Award for his performance. Suddenly, the industry began to see him differently. He was no longer just another struggling entertainer trying to find steady work. He was a rising star with a unique combination of talents that television executives believed could translate perfectly to the rapidly expanding medium of national broadcasting. That belief would soon lead to the project that would change his life forever: a television series that would place his name directly in the title, a show that would eventually become one of the most influential sitcoms in American history. But as often happens in Hollywood, The moment that launches a career can also bring pressures that no one sees at the time. And while the world was about to meet a smiling, energetic performer who seemed born for the spotlight, the reality behind that success was far more complicated than it appeared. By the early 1960s, the transformation of Dick Van Dyke from a struggling entertainer into a national sensation was nearly complete. What had once been a slow and uncertain climb suddenly accelerated with extraordinary force when American television audiences were introduced to a new series that carried his name directly in its title. The show was The Dick Van Dyke Show. Premiering in 1961 and created by television writer Carl Reiner, the series followed the fictional life of Rob Petrie, a comedy writer balancing the chaos of television production with family life at home. At first glance, the premise seemed simple, even ordinary. Yet the execution would become something revolutionary for its time. Van Dyke brought an unusual blend of warmth, physical comedy, and emotional sincerity to the role. His performances felt natural rather than exaggerated, a style that allowed audiences to see themselves in the character. Rob Petrie was not a distant celebrity. He was a husband, a father, and a man trying to navigate the awkward moments of everyday life. Viewers responded immediately. The series gradually became one of the most beloved sitcoms in American television history. Critics praised its intelligent writing, sharp humor, and the chemistry between Van Dyke and his co-star Mary Tyler Moore, whose portrayal of Laura Petrie helped redefine how women were depicted on television. Behind the scenes, Van Dyke's reputation within the industry continued to grow. Directors admired his discipline and instinctive understanding of comedy. Writers appreciated how he could transform even a simple line into something memorable through timing and movement. Over the course of the show's 5-season run, he would win multiple Emmy Awards, and the series itself would become a cultural landmark that influenced generations of sitcoms that followed. Yet television was only part of the story. In 1964, Van Dyke stepped into what would become one of the most iconic roles of his career when he appeared opposite Julie Andrews in the Disney musical Mary Poppins. The film combined live action and animation in a way that had rarely been attempted before, and Van Dyke's role as the cheerful Chimney Sweetbird allowed him to showcase every aspect of his talent. He danced across London rooftops, sang alongside animated characters, and delivered a performance bursting with infectious enthusiasm. For millions of children and families around the world, Burt became inseparable from Van Dyke himself. By the mid-1960s, he had achieved something few performers ever reach. He was not just famous, he was trusted. His presence on screen signaled joy, humor, and a sense of timeless optimism that audiences welcomed into their homes week after week. But fame, even when built on laughter and admiration, rarely tells the entire story. Because while the world saw a man who seemed to embody effortless happiness, the pressures of maintaining that image were quietly building beneath the surface. And in the years that followed, those pressures would begin to reveal a far more complicated reality behind one of Hollywood's brightest smiles. To millions of viewers, Dick Van Dyke appeared to live the kind of life that only Hollywood legends experience. He had fame, awards, beloved roles, and a career that seemed almost untouched by the darker scandals that often surround the entertainment industry. But behind the laughter and effortless charm that audiences saw on screen, Van Dyke was quietly fighting battles that very few people knew about at the time. One of the most significant struggles began during the height of his success in the 1960s. At the very moment when The Dick Van Dyke Show was reaching millions of households every week, Van Dyke began dealing with a serious alcohol problem. The pressure of constant work, the expectations of maintaining a perfect public image, and the demanding pace of television production slowly began to take a toll. For a performer known for physical precision and comedic timing, alcohol became both a temporary escape and a growing danger. Years later, Van Dyke would openly acknowledge how serious the situation had become. Recognizing that his drinking was spiraling beyond his control, he entered a hospital treatment program in the early 1970s. At a time when conversations about addiction were far less common than they are today, the decision required both humility and courage. His recovery would become one of the defining turning points of his personal life. Yet alcohol was not the only struggle he faced. In the decades that followed his television breakthrough, Van Dyke also spoke candidly about his experience with depression. Despite the continued admiration of fans and the respect of colleagues, there were periods when he felt disconnected from the very career that had brought him global recognition. For someone whose public identity was built around joy and energy, those moments of emotional difficulty created a quiet contradiction. The man who made audiences laugh across the world sometimes found himself searching for that same sense of happiness in his own private life. Personal relationships added further complexity. Van Dyke's first marriage to Margie Willett lasted more than 3 decades, beginning in 1948 and eventually ending in divorce in 1984. Like many long marriages strained by the pressures of fame and time, the relationship faced challenges that grew increasingly difficult to resolve. In later interviews, Van Dyke acknowledged that success and constant public attention can create emotional distance within a family, even when intentions remain sincere. Still, his story was never defined solely by struggle. Unlike many performers whose careers collapsed under similar pressures, Van Dyke continued working across television, film, and stage for decades. His willingness to speak honestly about addiction and emotional health also helped reshape how audiences understood the private lives of public figures. Rather than hiding those experiences, he gradually became more open about them. The smiling entertainer who once seemed almost impossibly perfect revealed himself to be something far more human. And in doing so, he gained a different kind of respect. Because behind the legendary performances, behind the iconic dance numbers and beloved characters, there was a man who had faced darkness, confronted it, and chosen to keep moving forward. But as time moved on and the years accumulated, a new reality began to emerge. Even legends eventually reach a point where the greatest challenge is no longer career or reputation. It is time itself. For most actors, reaching the later stages of life means quietly stepping away from the spotlight. The industry moves on, new faces replace old ones, and the once familiar names of Hollywood gradually fade into nostalgia. But Dick Van Dyke followed a very different path. Even as he entered his 80s and 90s, Van Dyke refused to disappear from public life. While many of his contemporaries had long retired, he continued appearing on television, attending industry events, and occasionally surprising audiences with performances that reminded everyone why he had become such a beloved figure in the first place. His presence carried something rare in Hollywood: longevity without bitterness. Fans who watched him during his later appearances often noticed something remarkable. The energy was still there, perhaps not with the same effortless athleticism that once allowed him to dance across rooftops in Mary Poppins, but the spark remained unmistakable. The quick humor, the gentle warmth, and the unmistakable voice that had once defined one of television's most influential sitcoms, The Dick Van Dyke Show. Yet aging, no matter how gracefully approached, inevitably brings change. In interviews during his later years, Van Dyke spoke candidly about the reality of growing older. He acknowledged the physical limitations that slowly emerge with time. Movements that once felt effortless required more care. Long days on film sets were no longer as easy as they had been decades earlier. Still, what struck many observers was not decline, but perspective. Van Dyke often emphasized gratitude. Rather than dwelling on what time had taken away, he spoke about the extraordinary length of his career and the opportunities he had been given. Few performers had experienced success across so many different eras of entertainment. From radio and early television to the digital age, his career had spanned nearly the entire modern history of American popular culture. His family also became an increasingly visible part of his life during these later years. Children, grandchildren, and extended relatives gathered around a man whose influence stretched far beyond the screen. For them, the public figure admired by millions was also a father and grandfather whose humor and optimism remained part of daily life. In quiet moments away from cameras, those closest to him understood something that fans around the world were beginning to recognize as well. They were witnessing the closing chapter of an extraordinary life. Not a sudden or tragic ending, but a gradual passage into the final stage of a story that had already lasted far longer than most careers in Hollywood ever do. And while the world continued to celebrate the laughter he had given to generations of audiences, his family understood that their role had begun to shift. They were no longer simply watching a legend perform. They were helping protect the legacy of a man who had spent nearly a century bringing joy to others. Because eventually, every career reaches a moment when the spotlight fades, and what remains is something deeper than fame. What remains is the life that was lived behind it. When people speak about the history of American entertainment, certain names appear again and again. Some are remembered for controversy, others for groundbreaking performances, and a few for achievements that permanently shaped the industry itself. Among those rare figures, Dick Van Dyke occupies a unique place. His legacy is not defined by a single role or a single decade. Instead, it stretches across generations. Audiences who grew up in the early 1960s remember him as Rob Petrie, the quick-witted comedy writer navigating family life on The Dick Van Dyke Show. For them, the series represented a turning point in television storytelling, blending intelligent humor with an honest portrayal of domestic life. A different generation discovered him through cinema. In Mary Poppins, Van Dyke's performance as Bird introduced millions of children to a character whose optimism and playful spirit felt almost timeless. Long after the film's release, those songs, dance sequences, and rooftop scenes remained etched in cultural memory. Yet perhaps the most remarkable part of Van Dyke's legacy lies beyond any single project. It lies in endurance. Very few entertainers maintain relevance across 70 years of cultural change. From the early days of black and white television to the modern era of streaming and digital media, Van Dyke continued to appear, perform, and inspire admiration. His career became a bridge connecting multiple eras of entertainment history. But legacy is rarely simple. Every public figure eventually leaves behind two stories. One is the story told by audiences, critics, and historians. It is the narrative of awards, iconic performances, and influence within the industry. The other story belongs to family, colleagues, and those who witnessed the private moments behind the spotlight. For Van Dyke, those two narratives appear unusually aligned. The warmth that audiences saw on screen was frequently echoed by the people who worked with him. Directors often described him as generous and collaborative. Fellow actors recalled an energy that made difficult productions feel lighter. That consistency may be the true reason why his influence feels so enduring. Because while Hollywood has produced countless stars, far fewer have managed to preserve both admiration and affection across such a long career. As time moves forward and new generations encounter his work for the first time, the question surrounding Dick Van Dyke's legacy becomes increasingly clear. Was his greatest achievement the characters he played? Or was it the spirit he carried into every performance? A spirit that suggested laughter could remain meaningful even in uncertain times. Perhaps that is why, decades after his first appearance on television screens, the image of Dick Van Dyke still feels strangely timeless. Not simply as a performer from another era, but as a reminder of what entertainment can look like when talent, resilience, and genuine joy exist in the same place. And as the curtain slowly lowers on one of Hollywood's longest and most remarkable careers, the question left behind is not whether his influence will endure,